Today's topic, which was suggested by board member Steve, he suggested that we talk about the West Virginia textbook war, is the colloquial name of that. And my personal background is in education, so I've actually been and I've got my degrees from inside the state. So this was discussed more than once in my education program. It was a big deal. So let me give you an overview, and then what I really want to talk about is how it's continuing to impact public education and public discourse, and really fueling the movement by a lot of fundamentalist Christian organizations to continue to invade the public square and force their views into government organizations and government policy and those types of things. Because this was really one of the first times that this type of thing had happened in modern United States. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so just a quick overview. So this goes back, took place in 1974 in Kanawha County, West Virginia. The textbook committee of the Board of Education had approved, let me get my numbers here, 325 textbooks that were deemed eligible for use within the classroom. These are the official books that you can use. Here you go. And those were passed on to the full board for approval. And the board generally said, yeah, okay, this seems fine. We'll just go through the typical motions of approval, but this doesn't look like a big deal, except for one person, and her name was Alice Moore, and she was the wife of a fundamentalist Christian preacher, and she began to go through some of the books to try to figure out if she was okay with it. So she discovered, as if it was a conspiracy, but she discovered that these textbooks, but especially the history and English textbooks, were trying to weave more multicultural content, more egalitarian type content into the books, which, one, speaking as an educator, highly necessary, especially at that time, and two, and I made a note for myself, how progressive was the 1974 Kanawha County, West Virginia School Board? Because, I mean, really, can you imagine that being a top concern of any modern school boards in the state of West Virginia? Probably not. Individuals may be concerned about it, but as a stated concern, I don't think that would happen. But she objected, and her specific objections were things like this. She felt that the books were implying that Appalachian English and African American vernacular English were equally correct. Heaven forbid. As if, well, okay. That they included quotes from Malcolm X, especially one that said that Christians were brainwashed. And also quotes from countercultural critics like Allen Ginsberg, Black Panther leaders like Eldridge Cleaver, and detailed discussions of Freud's Oedipal complex theory. Again, these kind of seem like things that you would expect in a history book or an English book or things like that, especially at the high school level, maybe first level college type stuff. But again, 1974, preacher's wife happens to be on the school board, infuriated by it. So she was so mad, she contacted an organization based in Texas, and it was an organization focused on, it was a right-wing, conservative Christian organization.
Family Research?
No, it was, and I didn't write down their name. It may have. We can look that up here in a minute if you want. It wasn't the Family Research Council. They weren't around back then. They didn't come around. Yeah, I think they came about in the 80s, late 80s. But the same point of view. I mean, even today, Texas is where, when you hear about textbooks being challenged or being filled with absolute nonsense, usually Texas. And there's a reason for that, because Texas is so big, like California, that if they adopt a textbook, then other states adopt it just because, it's the cheaper to do what Texas or California does, because otherwise you have to pay book publishers to print content for you. And while small states like West Virginia have to do that for West Virginia history because it is what it is, they don't want to do that for American history. They'll just pick what somebody else picks. So that's why Texas has always been very important in the modern age in textbook type of discussions. Okay, so this organization in Texas says, okay, gosh, this is terrible. You're right. Here's a bunch of pamphlets and here's some strategies you can use. She teamed up with them to learn what to do. And so after having that, she began a media campaign focused on local organizations like the PTA and the Mothers Association and all that kind of stuff, but also on the newspapers. And she started to gin that type of interest up. And in addition to using content that was indeed in the textbooks, although presented in the worst possible light, they would make up things from books they didn't like and quote that, even though that content was not in any of the textbooks. They just knew it would offend their base, and oh gosh, no, we can't have that. Well, it's not there, but they didn't care. It served a purpose. And so, at a board meeting on the 23rd of May of that year, she stood up and she proclaimed her points of view and her problems. And she made a statement in public that included the line that the textbooks should be rejected because they were filthy, disgusting trash, unpatriotic, and unduly favoring blacks. Which I think is important to note that she considered all of that equally problematic. Right? So clearly, not only is there a fundamentalist Christian element running through this opposition, there's a clear racist element running through this opposition, without question. It was publicly stated. So she won the support of the local PTA. They backed her. But what was interesting is that the West Virginia Council of Churches backed the textbook selection, which, again, 1974, these are things that you would not necessarily expect. Things have changed in the state. So in June of that year, following month, the Board of Education held their meeting to determine, to approve or disapprove the textbook selection. And it was a 3-hour meeting. There were 1,000 people in attendance. It was this long, arduous, drawn-out affair. But believe it or not, they actually approved the original textbook selection. Again, things that I don't know would happen nowadays in our state. This, of course, infuriated Alice Moore and all of her fundamentalist Christian allies. And they immediately said, well, we're going to boycott the public schools. And at its peak, this boycott had 9,000 of the 45,000 students staying home from school. So it was a sizable chunk of people. But it got worse than that. It quickly escalated to outright violence, which is why this is often termed a textbook war and not just a protest. So let me read down the list. Bombs were found at the Board of Education offices and at an elementary school. One elementary school was actually bombed successfully with dynamite. School buses were shot at, which led to the shooting of a bystander. Did not die, but was shot with a shotgun. Homes that were not participating in the boycott were stoned. Of course, they were. Anyways. The one local reverend publicly prayed for God to kill anyone mocking the fundamentalists. And one person eventually was sentenced to 3 years in prison for the bombings and attempted bombings. And that seemed to lead to throwing cold water on the aggressiveness of the protests and the boycott. It petered out after that. And then in 75, the school board affirmed the choice of the textbooks. And even though those textbooks were there, this really has been seen as a victory for the modern religious right movement, because it showed that there was an underlying population of people, thousands of people, even in compared to most counties in the United States, a relatively small county, population-wise, where that type of rhetoric would buy you political power, public attention, and those types of things. It was seen as an outright revolt in response to the liberalization of the late 60s in American life, and the civil rights movement and those types of things. So there have been some researchers and several books written on this event, and they directly point to the that's probably the wrong word to use, the injection of right-wing um, culture wars into the environment, into the American political environment on this event. That this was the Boston Tea Party or the Lexington and Concord of the religious right, the religious fundamentalists wanting to fight back by injecting their views into public policy. It also directly led to the explosion of private Christian schools across the state. That before this event, that was not, other than the Catholic schools, which had a long history, um, there really wasn't a network of Protestant Christian schools across the state. But this changed that immediately because they saw that this is the only way to protect their children from multiculturalism and egalitarianism and
I just had to look up like where Kanawha County was, and
oh yeah.
it's just like there's not a lot of there's not a lot of I'm sure diversity already there, and there's not a lot of like movement of ideas through that area.
Well, that's true of the state. It does have the capital, of course. So but it also for West Virginia, land-wise, area-wise, it's a large county, and so Kanawha is this weird, but it's a mirror of the whole state.
Mhm.
So you've got the areas around Charleston that are more college educated, a little more diverse, a little more outward looking, but you've got rural areas that are just as rural and not appreciative of diversity as perhaps any other rural area would be anywhere in the United States. And you've got them within miles of each, just a handful of miles of each other. So it's like Morgantown. It's not unlike parts of Wood County that you've got that urban-rural divide. That's nationwide, but in West Virginia, the odd thing is that they're so close together, so very close together. I once took when I was working for a particular university. Um, I had a student from a very affluent area of Northern Virginia, and he was coming with us to go to the Capitol to do a little lobbying on behalf of the university that I worked for. And the area that we drove through, first of all, he was amazed because we would drive through areas where there would be a beautiful, modern, three-story brick house with great grounds, and literally on the other side of the fence or wall would be a trailer park. And he was just dumbfounded. I'm like, he said, well, why, or how? And I'm like, well, that's West Virginia. It's how I grew up. It was absolutely like that. And then he gets to the Capitol building, which is one of the most ornate Capitol buildings in the United States, with gold leaf on the dome. And he was appalled. He said, how can a poor state have a Capitol building like this? I'm like, well, it's a little more complicated than that, but I get your point. It is an awfully ornate Capitol building for a relatively poor state. So you're right. I mean, it's Kanawha County is like that, but so is the rest of the state. It's a mirror of the state.
Well, and with Kanawha County, though, you actually had a fairly large African American population.
Very much.
That stemmed from, like when red salt was found in the Kanawha River Valley and the timber industry came here. There, even though West Virginia did not enter the Union as a slave state, there was still basically indentured servitude in the African American community that was transferred to Kanawha County. And so there's a large base of African Americans there.
Like the mining equivalent of the mining and forestry equivalent of like sharecropping in a way. It's like you can't get out of it. You're so far in the hole.
Right, and that community, like many other African American communities, when the interstate came through, Charleston rightly said, well, we want the interstate in town because it's an economic development issue, unlike some other cities in our state, which forced it to go way outside of town. But where did they choose to put the interstate in Charleston? Right through the heart of the African American community, and destroyed that neighborhood because it certainly wasn't going to go in the white areas of town. We'll just put it right through the African American areas of town. But it's also the home of the largest historically black institution in the state. It's and it's which has generated many very successful scientists and teachers and entertainers.
I hate to throw this out there, but have you ever noticed the poorest states in the Union are the most Trump states? Louisiana, Mississippi, West Virginia, still on the list. The poorest states are Trump and Republican.
Well, even taking it outside of a political context, although you're right, as a general rule, if you look at the states that are the most religious, They're also the states that are the poorest, and also the most that are they're also the most that tend to vote conservative. There is a trinity, if you'll pardon the term, between between poverty and voting against your interests. Absolutely, and having that lack of orientation, all the other stuff that goes with that, such as lower education rates and health rates and all those other things. So that's absolutely true. I mean, it is. What I said, even if you take the current political climate out of it, it's still there, and it's been there for decades and decades. And that's probably another discussion, another presentation about why religion and conservatism all go together in America, because it didn't always used to be that way. Back before Reagan and Nixon, really Nixon, there was no, I mean, if you were Christian, you were as likely to vote Democrat as Republican, or even socialist for that matter.
You can also see there's a little bit of like similarities with, not that I was like then, but it's some from the back end, like similarities with like a cult of personality.
Mm-hmm.
That's the biggest thing I can think of was the similarities between Reagan and Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, oh, a famous dude on TV says these things, or is in a movie, and that's who they vote for.
Well, drawing it back to the textbook issue, if we think for a moment, so Nixon's reelected, and this silent, the silent moral majority that supposedly is out there voting for him gets cut down because he was forced to resign to avoid impeachment, and so they've gone from political ascendancy to being in this political wilderness because their leader has been taken out through legal methods.
Disgrace.
Right,
Disgrace.
and disgrace, that's right. So this textbook controversy gave them a blueprint for how to climb back into political power, not necessarily based on a cult of personality, but although there are always a measure of that, and it exploded recently, but based on this sense of grievance. How dare you want to share the public square with us? The public square belongs to the conservative, patriotic, Christian, white, male part of the country. And this textbook committee, in the smallest of ways, starts to say, well, we need to have everybody in the public square. Everyone needs to be at the table. And the response of this, not a majority, but the response of a very loud, well-organized, violent minority was to say, no, it's ours. Now extrapolate that. Those are the folks who elected Reagan, who started his campaign in an appallingly racist rally. That's right. That's right. He started his campaign there as a wink to some of the most racist elements in the United States. And then you draw that line all the way to our current president, who goes to lengths that Reagan's folks would have maybe agreed with, but could have never thought they would have gotten away with. And I think there's an argument to say that the blueprint for all of this is linked to that 1974 West Virginia textbook war.
Well, and the same thing happened right here in Parkersburg with the NDO.
We
That's
still
true.
see it today. We
Yeah.
still see that enormous minority
Yeah.
backlash.
Yeah, the whole church came, like
Yeah.
the whole religious
They
group
formed Parkersburg.
Right. And so that brings up a point I wanted to point out. And you're right, the NDO is another very good, Parkersburg NDO is another very good example of this. So it's often been said that it's easier to organize the religious or the conservative because they're more willing to follow. Whereas folks who are non-religious or secular, we have opinions. And
Well, even asking questions upset some religious.
Yes.
that's true too.
You can mind
But-
the line.
But if you want to organize folks to go to a city council meeting to shout down, a non-discrimination ordinance, or to support it, who's easier to get in the room? The folks who are affiliated with that more religious organization or point of view, or more fundamentalist point of view, because they've already made the choice to surrender their judgment to someone or something else. Whereas on the other side of that fence, as we sit here and have discussion, we know that we're not like that. And that takes long. We have much more interest in consensus and science and reason and stats and all these other things. That takes time.
Yeah, more interested in nuances.
Right.
Because sometimes the details do matter.
Absolutely. Well, I think they always matter. We want to live in an evidence-based world because it is an evidence-based world. Um, but folks who have surrendered their judgment to other folks through a religious process or even an ideological process, you don't have to convince them. Joining in is part of the faith. It's an act of faith. It's a public declaration that I'm a good person if I just blindly follow that type of thing.
Now, as we were talking earlier about, where you said it was Mercer County,
Yeah.
she went money. So I lost.
Well, no, what happens is it'd be the same thing with the Parkersburg lawsuit. The people, I mean, FFRF represented her too, so there will be $200,000 or $300,000 that they have to pay for pursuing this case.
Well, they're paying out. So
They're paying, not her, but they're paying.
what I'm saying is, I told you before, when someone takes it out of their pocket, they remember.
Right.
If they didn't put any money out, they'll do it again. They won't think twice.
Oh, they have to pay for pursuing this.
So Parkersburg, where do you think this is going now? This Parkersburg.
It's going to be and I'll talk more about it later, but
Okay.
it's going to be the same thing. They're going to pay probably at this point between $100,000 and $200,000 for pursuing the case as far as they choose to pursue.
Put it that way, but you gotta hit their pocketbook so they'll remember.
Just the fact that they authorized, what was it, $9,000 or $10,000?
It was 9,800, wasn't it?
9,800.
Yeah.
To begin with. And
Yeah.
you're just like, you're not, this is a, you're gonna pay, like, if the house is gonna win. It's not, it's like, you put down and you think you're going, and you're gonna be in the hole, and the house is gonna take.
And if you
all of that.
if you look at poll numbers, and I don't know if there's any official poll numbers on the NDO if that was ever done or not, but if you look nationwide at poll numbers, folks tend to agree with the positions of secular humanists and atheists. Reasonable abortion access is widely supported by the United States. Gun control is rational gun control is widely supported by the citizens of the United States. Controls on insurance, all these other things that are rational things but that's not what makes it to a representative area, because it's all when you want to elect someone who's easier to organize. Typically there has to be a high level of outrage to overcome the base organization advantage of folks who give up their own judgment to other people.
It's authoritarianism, and it really is minority tyranny, because I talked about this yesterday with someone, and he had these really interesting observations. He was from Jefferson County, but if you really look at the Electoral College, the origins of the U.S. Senate, even before it was popular election, the origins of the U.S. Senate, the origins of the Electoral College were protections of the slave states.
That's right.
Even the Second Amendment was a slave state protection.
That's right.
They did not want the federal government encroaching on their rights to hold slaves, and so you have this Second Amendment. The final product was worded differently, but it was still about that. And so some of the things that we're trying to overcome, and this is where his interesting observation came in. I'd never thought of it this way. He said if you read Jefferson and Madison, Jefferson particularly said that the Constitution really should be changed or altered or updated in some way, probably about every 50 to 75 years. And they, think about it, they passed this thing, they voted on this thing in the summer of 1787. By 1791, we had 10 amendments. They wanted this to be a living, fluid, changing document. And today, as this gentleman I was talking to pointed out, a very young man in high school, he said, we have one of the oldest constitutions in the world, and we appoint people to the Supreme Court who, like Clarence Thomas or Antonin Scalia before he died, who say that they're originalists, they're strict constructionists, they want to interpret the Constitution as written, when even the authors said this has to be a living document. We can't encompass everything in 7 articles for the rest of America.
It's become an ideology to say that the Constitution has some sort of inherent inviolability.
Right.
It can't be changed.
Kind of, there's probably a lot of overlap between the people that take that stance and the people who take the stance that the Bible is.
Well, think about it. Well, yeah, right. But think about it for a second. So, what the if the Constitution were meant to be unchanged, we voted on it. It's in. There you go. Who voted on the Constitution? Old white men, a significant portion of which were slave owners.
Yeah.
Okay.
Landowners.
And landowners. That's right. So, rich white men, many of whom were slave owners and landowners. Okay. So, the Constitution is a reflection of their concerns. Period. Now, they weren't royalists. Fair enough. But they were not Democrats in the small d sense either. They were Republicans, and back then that meant rule by the wealthy who were allowed to vote. It's ruled by whoever's allowed to vote, and back then it was a very small group of people. So we have changed the Constitution here and there, but we've not changed it enough because, no, I don't know that we need a Senate anymore, and people will scream about that because it actually would reduce West Virginia's influence. Well, we don't have a lot of people, so okay, maybe we shouldn't have that.
Land doesn't vote.
That's right. Land doesn't vote. People do. Land doesn't vote. And land doesn't have rights either. I'm sorry.
Michael Moore the other day said that picture where Nancy Pelosi is pointing her finger up.
Yeah.
Everybody in that room was old white men.
That's right.
One woman died. He said that's the last picture you're going to see like that in the future. You're going to see a whole different room in the future. Not old white men deciding everything.
But several months ago, we were having a discussion, and you said that what we're going through now is an extinction burst of, which I really like that. Yeah, I really like
I
that.
mean, it's a psychological, like when you're training a dog or training or even training a small human to okay, don't freak out in a store. Like they might go through where they freak out all the time, and then they're gonna be okay.
Right. And my background, right, and from my perspective as a historian, that speaks to me because that extinction burst is not just in a few weeks. It's over the scale of a generation or more. So another way to look at the textbook issue and things like it is that these are extinction bursts. We've all seen, and there's been a new round of reporting on it recently, about the steep decline in not just church going, but in people who claim to be Christian in the United States. It's undergoing a steep decline. And there's also, we can talk, at another point we can talk about the reasons for that.
Yeah.
But the point is that people who are in that world, in the Christian world, they know it. They know it because it's harder and harder to fill the pews. They've got the attendance numbers from last week and this week on that. Every church in West Virginia I've been in has one, except for the Catholic ones, have the attendance numbers on. So it's just a thing.
Because the Catholic ones don't want to advertise.
Yeah, right. So, but they have the attendance board up front. And they know it's going down, and they look around, and everybody's older, and where there's kids, well, there's a few young kids, and there's a few here, but nobody, the young people aren't here. And so they try to have rock bands and games and concerts and giveaways and whatever they can think of, and it's not working.
Church is the size of a city block.
That's right, and none of it's
directing traffic.
That's right. And none of it's working. It may work for, it may, like those large churches, like the one in Vienna, it might gather people together, but it's just cannibalizing the small churches in the area to go to the big church. They're not adding people to the population.
Yeah. Smaller churches are bad like that too.
Yeah.
They don't like them.
Yeah. And in fact, on a humorous aside, if anybody's watching The Righteous Gemstones on HBO, which everybody, if you can, needs to be watching, especially if you're on our side of the fence. Aside from the fact that it's funny, it is a brutal takedown of evangelical, of the business of being a church, and that's one of the plot points. Is that a big church comes to town, and it's like the mob moving in, and they play it out. And it's, the small churches get together and say, "How dare you? We're afraid you're going to take away our business." And the big church folk just shrug and say, "Free market, come see us if they want to." But of course, they're, and then they slowly kill all the small churches.
I've seen Bill Maher do that, but what one are you talking about?
It's called The Righteous Gemstones. It's fictional.
Oh,
But it's very, very good. It's got John Goodman and Danny McBride, if you know who he is. He's brilliant. And a bunch of other folks are in it. But strongly, strongly recommend watching that. So, but it plays that type of stuff out. Um, so
I want to say it's on Hulu, or is it on Amazon?
it's HBO.
It's HBO, okay.
Yeah, it's not television.
Because we watch HBO through Hulu, and that's where I'm like, oh.
Yeah. You can do that.
HBO add-on.
Yeah, or Amazon, they do it there too.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. So, any other thoughts on textbooks, this specifically, before we go to a more general discussion?
I just want to throw a general thing. On the Charleston Gazette had a thing about John Brown's invasion.
Uh-huh.
There were 5 black people killed in that.
Mhm.
They're only being recognized today.
It's not unsurprising.
It's how much time passed before they're even recognized.
Well, and it's like this. So, whether we're talking race or economic class or any of those other divisions that are exploited. So, when I went from high school in southern West Virginia to having history classes at WVU, the amount of things I learned about my state that I never knew about, whether it was the textbook war, which is where I found out about that, or the mine wars, I lived in an area that was directly affected by the mine wars. I went on to find out that I had relatives who had participated in it on both sides. And you didn't speak about it because they were afraid, even 50 years later, that they'd be arrested and tried for treason, because that's what happened to many of the people who participated. So they buried the guns in the woods and don't tell anybody. And so I'm going to school on the edge of where all this happened. I didn't find out about it until I was in a college course because they don't want you to know. They don't want you to know that there was a time when 10,000 miners got together south of Charleston and were marching to Mingo County, not to burn the place to the ground, but to restore democracy. Because in Mingo they were throwing people in jail without any violation of the law, just because they were thought to be Union sympathizers. And it was, they don't want you to know any of that. They don't want you to know that African American folks, especially in the early part of the 20th century, that if they had a successful neighborhood in a major city, well, there was a likelihood it was going to be burned to the ground. Why? Because people were whipped up into being jealous, because despite everything thrown in their way, they built a successful community. Well, let's tear it down.
And self-supporting.